BWI Daily Edition brought to you in full HD for the first time ever. I'm super stoked. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr. I have the capability to go to 4K. I dumb it down for the rest of everybody else. Nate Bauer. Plus, uploading these files to YouTube would destroy me. It would be a 3-day process. But Nate Bauer joining us today on the BWI Daily Edition. It's our mailbag episode and our practice review. Sights and sounds you can check out in our highlight video what we heard and the players we spoke to after practice. We're getting into that today and your questions. So Nate, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited about this. We have upgraded our technological capabilities because if people want anything, it's to see me more clearly.
Yes.
Right? Like that's top of the list of priorities. So we've accomplished this. We're making moves. We're doing things here.
Yeah, I think it shows dedication and commitment to what we're doing here on YouTube. So if you're listening on our podcast, first off, I totally get it. There's a lot of commute time for a lot of people. But we're both very good-looking people, and I show you video here on YouTube. So we'll be getting into some of that. And, of course, like I said, highlight video from yesterday came out right after practice, so you can check out what we saw from Blue White Illustrated's vantage point. And I'm going to get into the mailbag. I'm going to dip into the mailbag quickly because somebody asked me about something about the offensive line. In fact, it happened twice yesterday. And one of the comments was, why haven't we heard more about the offensive line? You guys need to So how it works, Nate, please explain to the people how it works when it rains outside and we cover Penn State football.
Yes. So two things. One, it rains every day in State College.
It really does.
There are no days of the year where it's not raining.
Yep.
So naturally, because of that, honestly, it wasn't even raining yesterday afternoon, but it had rained earlier in the day. And so because of that, they practice inside. Yep. They don't take any risks. And obviously, of course you want it. So, but when they move it inside, there is a limited range for the media to be able to kind of roam around. And so what happens is the defensive line and the offensive line are on the far side of the field. So the bottom line here is we can't see them even if we wanted to. And we do want to. We would love to see the offensive line. We would love to be able to take it in, but they are really, really far away because it's not just the, as James Franklin likes to say, the 53 1/3 of the field that they're beyond that, right?
And yes, and we're on the other side of the beyond, so we're not on the field. Yeah, so it's quite the distance, plus some of the requirements, how the sausage is really made, some of the things they ask of us to show and not show, some of the things they ask us to do and not do. When you go to practice, it's not a free-for-all. And to get any of those things, you can't. So on days when it rains, you should be hoping for sunny weather and 60 degrees for Wednesdays from now until the end of the blue-white game so that I can get my camera right up in everyone's face when they're on the offensive line, because I can when they're outside. I said somebody asked about Landon Tengwall. I'm like, he could have been doing inverted sit-ups off of somebody else's shoulders and I wouldn't have seen it, just because it's so far away and I'm doing what I'm doing to get you what we do here on the YouTube channel. So that answers a couple of the questions that we couldn't really get to during the mailbag. But what did you hear from Penn State head coach James Franklin? We got our first time to talk to Manny Diaz in person. And then, of course, Curtis Jacobs last night. So I'll start the bidding wherever you'd like. Actually, you can start the bidding of where you want to talk about those three players and some of what you heard yesterday from them.
Yeah, so I think that the top point for me, and these tie together, right, is that they're considering changes to the blue-white game. And changes to the blue-white game are as a result of how thin they are on the offensive line. That's something that Franklin brought up really from the beginning of spring practice, but the fact that he came back to it on Wednesday night, I think suggested pretty strongly to me, look, like they're not panicking. This isn't a freak out situation, but they don't have enough bodies to be able probably to put on a blue-white game where they're comfortable. right? Like you've got Sal Wormley coming off of a season-ending injury last year. And so even though he's back and able to participate somewhat in spring practices, it's not to the level where he's going to be out there in the blue-white game, right? So like you lose one there. They've had some other bumps and bruises, some guys who are dealing with some things. And so because of all of that, plus the loss of Rasheed Walker, plus the loss of other offensive linemen that they've had there. This is the situation that they're in, and you're going to see ramifications from that in the blue-white game.
What did I say all last season, all off-season this year about the transfer portal? James Franklin said it last night. It's hard to have depth with the transfer portal. He mentioned, and he went on about this because obviously this is something he wants to get out there, but it's just because it's a stump speech by James Franklin doesn't make it inaccurate or wrong. It's not just Penn State. Teams across the nation don't have the depth of players to put on a spring game. They don't have the depth of... And by the way, that leads to depth during the season. I think it's a pretty obvious thing, but it leads to depth problems, are a systemic problem in college football right now because nobody has players in the middle of their roster. If you're a redshirt sophomore and you're not starting, there's a 50-50 chance you transfer. I mean, look at the safety position. I know there were some things that went on there with the depth outside of just, not playing, but they lost two of their veteran depth players that might have contributed this year because of the transfer portal. That's just one position where they were thin at numbers, and they had to move Zachy Wheatley over there, not just because of his long-term projection at safety, but also because they needed him there in the spring. They're bringing in a big class, but they only have 4 guys right now.
Yep. No, and I mean, he's going to play anyway, but I think that the point in the transfer portal, and something that James Franklin has touched on previously, but look, there's no reason to think that the NCAA is going to get its act together, right?
Or if they even can.
Correct. So there's that side of things. But if they could, if there was a way to formalize and standardize rules, you would be looking at a new structure in which you can, there are going to be like periods of time where you should be able to recruit exclusively the portal and change roster balances, right? Like, because that's what this is about, is the it's an 85 scholarship limit, which I think is probably debatable as to that's effectiveness anyway. But like, maybe they're going to have to divvy that up, right? So like, maybe it's not 85, maybe it becomes 95. And maybe of those 95, you top out at 15 transfers, right? Or like, or something to standardize so that you're able to conduct practices, right? Like, it's not in the NFL on your 53-man roster. You just go buy the next body that can come in and fulfill that for you. And you already have it because you have practice rosters as it is in the NFL. College football doesn't work that way. And so you've hit this, you've run into a wall of impracticality where it just doesn't work as it is right now.
I'm imagining 18-year-old T-Frank on campus at Penn State, hearing that there's a lack of depth on the Penn State football team, having 6 months of football under my belt and being like, dude, this is the perfect time to try out for a Division I football team because everyone needs bodies. Like, hell, I'll try out. I don't know if I'll make the team, but they need people. And that's James Franklin talked about that. You can find bodies at most positions through run-on or walk-on tryouts, except for some key ones like, I don't know, offensive line. It's a problem right now in college football. Yep.
So no, I mean, I'm right with you. It's just they have some hurdles personnel wise that many other universities and programs are experiencing right now that, frankly, and they're acknowledging it. I'm not sure how how much they're trying to like pound the drum about this, but he's putting it out there. Like, they don't have enough players. They don't have enough players on the offensive line to be able to conduct a normal spring game.
And this This is coming out sometime today at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. James Franklin, I asked him about defensive ends and their situation there, speaking of not enough bodies. I want you to give your initial impressions of his comments about defensive end and the portal in general, because once again, we had a long conversation with James Franklin about the portal, and every single time you ask him, he brings up the fact that guys just commit places without ever actually doing any due diligence. So what are your thoughts about his fresh round of comments on the portal with the defensive end in mind?
Yeah, it's a little bit of your getting your lighter out, like the hits, because we've heard this a lot, right? I mean, he's obviously got opinions about the portal, but also at the same time, I think that the turn that you're starting to see is he's publicly recruiting for these things. And on Wednesday night, that public recruiting was for a defensive end. Mm-hmm. And you asked it, and it was a great question because you knew where he had to go with the answer, which is they don't have edge rushers. They have defensive ends. Nick Tarburton is a guy who is reliable, and you kind of know what you're going to get there. Smith Vilbert is a guy who shows flashes but struggles to do it consistently.
Yep.
And then Adisa Isaac, who James Franklin brought up specifically as being the guy that they're banking on as an edge rusher, is coming off of a pretty severe, debilitating season-ending injury.
Yep.
And so they have no choice but to seek options, and they're seeking options through the transfer portal. And he said that he put it out there last night. Hey, Penn State needs this. They don't have enough of it. And the only way to fulfill this for Penn State is to seek experienced players, right? Like singular or
maybe even not experienced, honestly, maybe not even experienced with some of the guys they've hosted on campus. So the reason I phrased the question the way I did is because it's not just about bodies. They've got enough bodies. Zariah Fisher, Nick Tarburton, Smith Vilbert, Devon Townley. They've got bodies, and they can play Hakeem Beamon if they want to at defensive end. They've got tweeners. They've got versatility. They've got good run stuffers. They got all of that. The one thing they don't have is a fastball, and that's why edge pressure. So guys in the portal, one of the guys, and this is kind of something I get into in the article, is like one of the guys they're recruiting played nose tackle for the majority of his snaps. Now, that is because West Virginia used him, I think, incorrectly based on his skill set, and Penn State probably sees an inefficiency there that they can take advantage of. But there's not proof that he's a bona fide edge rusher in Akeem Mizador. Right. So they need that specifically in the portal. And the most important thing to me is, we talk about NIL a lot on this show. We talk about how it's going to impact sports.
Yep.
I'm drawing a direct line right now between the on-field performance next season and NIL, because Penn State needs a pass rusher. And Dominius Robinson is the other guy from that they hosted recently. Maryland, top 65 player in the nation in his recruiting class, left Maryland after 1 year. Extremely talented edge rusher. Not a lot proven at the college football level. But our own Ryan Snyder, and this is obvious too, based on his the way he's conducted himself, he's already signed with an NIL company.
Yeah.
NIL is going to be a huge factor for him. And he's got a lot of interest from a lot of schools that recruited him the first time around, not just Penn State. Penn State already lost out on their first preference, which were Gabriel and Grayson Murphy, in part because of NIL. So if Penn State can't sack the quarterback next year, don't blame John Scott Jr. The way that everyone's getting these premium positions in the portal, because you can't have depth anymore, is going out and getting them in the transfer portal. And if Penn State loses out on these three players, NIL is the reason that they don't get sacks next season. Now, you can point to development. Sure, that is a part of it, and that's what James Franklin talked about last night as well. But is Nick Tarburton going to be a great pass rusher in his career, Nate? Like, even at his best, he's a good player.
Right. No, it's interesting to me because one, and I think that we've talked about this before, they have shifted away somewhat philosophically from sacks being paramount, right? If you're looking at Penn State football 4 years ago, 3 years ago, getting to 40, 50 sacks a year was a big deal. Like they did that all the time. They have shied away from that a little bit, and I don't think based on personnel. I think that Ebiketie can be the example in the transfer portal of a guy whose exposure was probably limited, who Penn State was able to utilize well, and now he is looking like what, T-Frank, late first, early second, right?
Yeah,
Draft pick.
his production, his skill, all those things to me is a late first round pick. So some teams are not going to like him because he doesn't have massive frame to play defensive end and be that all around guy. But I think he proved through his ability to stop the run with quickness in his hands and his unreal metrics as a pass rusher that he, both at Temple and at Penn State, that he is a legit pass rusher. And first round in a kind of a weak draft, I would go after that. I would absolutely go after that if I'm a team that plays a 4-down front that's all about getting to the quarterback and, stopping the run is sort of a secondary thing. Think like the Colts with Dwight Freeney and Robert Mathis. Any team that does that, absolutely go get a guy that is 250, plays the run well, but you really want him just getting to the quarterback. So yeah, that's exactly right. And Penn State, through the portal, helped him to get to that. But if you're looking at the now and not the future, that's the change here. That's the biggest change is that guys are thinking they're going to get both.
I think, I mean, look, and I said this the other day on our message board, I really do think that what's so curious about this is you look at the NFL, right? And because we need something to compare this to.
Yeah.
There's a salary cap, right? Like there's a there's a limit to your budget as a franchise in terms of who you can bring in. You can't. There are certain rules that are in place to prevent certain teams from going way over the top, right? There's no cap on NIL.
Nope.
It is simply the infrastructure that you're, not you personally as the university or the athletic department, but your community has in place to be able to support these athletes. And so I do think that Penn State will represent a step up for certain players.
Yeah.
And let's be honest about this. There are going to be programs that Penn State will also feed, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and this is the way that it has been working in basketball for a little bit. You've seen Penn State as a direct recipient of this, of having some players who developed somewhere else at a lower level and came to Penn State, and Jalen Pickett, great example, is able to shine. There's probably a possibility, barring rules changes, that Penn State will develop players who have an opportunity to join a better, more robust NIL ecosystem at a bigger program and cash in off of that, unless, and this is why it continues to be such an important conversation, unless Penn State gets up to speed in that category, which is not out of the realm of possibility. There are so many avenues from which Penn State can develop that as a community, right? And form the type of infrastructure that these players will find attractive, and that Penn State will overwhelmingly be the landing spot. But it's dicey. It's a precipice right now.
Yep. And if I had to guess, I know James Franklin would and is trying to develop that and to be on the, as he said 4 or 5 times in December, on the cutting edge of things. But it can also go back to recruiting, and you can kind of lean heavily on that of make sure we bring in guys that want to be at Penn State and NIL, like getting to the NFL, doing it the traditional way. You're still going to have a couple of those guys for a while, but you're absolutely right. There's a future where it becomes an adapt or die ecosystem where that's what it is right now. So where does the Nittany line fit in that jungle? Quickly, we have to get to Curtis Jacobs because you talked to him. But we spent entirely too much time, which is always my fault as the captain of the ship, on other things. So what did Curtis Jacobs have to say? Because you got to talk to him last night while I was talking to Manny Diaz.
Yeah, I thought there were a couple of takeaways from Curtis, which were he did not commit publicly to the will, right?
Okay.
He was asked very specifically, are you doing both, Sam and Will? What, where are you at? And he was like, I can't talk about that. Sorry. So take that for what it is. I asked with the underlying intention of just kind of trying to see where his mind is at on all of this, about changes that he tried to make to his body over the offseason. And he stressed that the winter for him was all about getting quicker. He wanted to be faster sideline to sideline. He thinks that's what he does best, and that is how he can be most productive for Penn State. So I thought that was interesting because I don't know, he looked a little bit bigger to me. I don't know from your perception where you think he looks if he added a little bit of weight, but certainly that's what he stressed as being important to him. And then sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I didn't get a chance to really get a good look as I was on my way out. I was on to another event later in the day, so I didn't get a chance to, stop over there, which I regret. But because I think that he's a fascinating player, and I think that he's obviously very important, and he's also great to talk to. So I didn't get a chance to see any of those things, but you were going to go. I derailed us again. Continue.
Yeah, no, just two things. One, I was going to say, you are the one person I know who actually knows what they're talking about when they notice 5 pounds in weight gain and 10 pounds, right? Anybody else who talks about slimming down and stuff like that, I'm like, what are we talking about, guys?
So yeah, that was something we did talk about that earlier this offseason. I noticed all of the linebackers lost weight, but when it's 3 or 4 pounds, you don't know if that's intentional or just on a 6'1" athlete, is that I didn't have my morning juice. So, water weight can be 3 pounds on somebody who's 230, but it does sound like it was intentional, and it's part of, maybe it's not exactly a part of Manny Diaz's scheme, but this speed, movement, fluidity of positions in that first level of coverage is absolutely something that has been a part of his defense that I saw on film. So it does make sense that he didn't bulk up to get physical. He is focusing on movement and beating people with that.
Yep. And then last thing was just Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. It's mandatory to ask about those guys at this point.
Yep. And
he said, not that this is unexpected, but guess what the word was with Nick Singleton? Burst.
Yep.
Right. Burst is he hits the hole and that's it. And then I don't want to misquote him, but I think he called Katron Allen a wrecking ball. Right. So big dude who is tough and physical. So I think that, this is a storyline that we've been tracking throughout the spring, but you're talking about an injection of elements to that running back room that didn't exist.
Yep.
And so whether or not that completely upends or disrupts the pecking order, I'm not sure. I don't really want to take a guess at that right now because the order is still the same that we see in practices, right? You're still seeing Kevon Lee at the top.
Yep.
But I think has universally been acknowledged as something that is a necessity for that room is to add those ingredients to what they're capable of doing.
Yeah. And I think that both are making a case you can't redshirt either of them. And I thought maybe if the guys above them stepped up too, you could have that conversation. But if they're just as good, you've got to play the guy that's the best. So that's going to be very interesting to watch this spring and then to the fall. Okay, let's get to our questions today because we got some good ones. And we will be, I think, circling back a little bit to some of the conversations we already had with these questions. But as always, if you want to get your questions on the air with Nate and T-Frank during the BWI Mailbag, the best place to go is BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Sign up for just $1 and get 12 months of access to things that are important, like the Lions Den message forum, where you get a front row seat. You get to fast pass the line at Disney World to get your questions on the show. We absolutely answer those first, unless there's things like we can't answer on air for one reason or another, and then we get to those on the message board. So we'll get to those right now. If Charlie Katcher can't go as Curtis Jacobs' backup, who is the backup? And I think this is kind of going back to that conversation about Curtis Jacobs, size, mobility. Where does Charlie Katcher fit in that lineup? Do you have any reads on this to start as far as, I don't think it matters. I think that there's going to be a couple of guys there that are fighting for time. But to me, it's Curtis Jacobs. And then Curtis Jacobs, I know you're tired, but you're going to stay on the field.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question. Honestly, I certainly think the catcher is the most. Well, first of all, catcher can play both box positions, right? So that he's an option there. But yeah, I mean, I think that if you go back, I don't have it in front of me, but if you go back and look at the snap counts, Penn State does not shy away from leaning heavily on their starters.
Yes.
Like really, really heavily. Yep. So, in terms of primary backup to Curtis Jacobs, I think that you may be looking at a situation. Well, and this is true anyway, in terms of cross training, that they really want their linebackers to be able to play all three spots, if at all possible. And so kind of like the offensive line a little bit, whoever is the primary backup, quote unquote, doesn't necessarily mean they're the fourth best linebacker, whereas the fourth best linebacker, like if Curtis Jacobs got hurt,
right,
it would be the fourth best linebacker who gets on the field at that point, which to me sounds like a Jamari Button, right, or a Tyler Elsdon, Kobe King, whoever doesn't win that, Mike.
That's correct. Right. Yeah, and there's there's some dancing around parts of this that we're doing right now to be transparent about the question. But I'm curious too, as a side conversation, what is the future with Manny Diaz at that Sam linebacker position? Because they keep saying linebacker and Jonathan Sutherland linebacker. They're not saying safety. So is Budden the backup Sam? Is he the backup Will? Has he moved over to Will? These are, I didn't get to ask any of these questions, and Curtis Jacobs didn't seem like he was interested in giving up positional information the other day. But then it becomes a guy like Keon Wiley on deck, too, as a freshman. They talked about Abdul Carter coming in and playing Mike. So that gives you some flexibility there as well. I don't think either Elsdon or King are a Will the way Manny Diaz explains them as far as run, hit, tackle, pass rush. But if push comes to shove and Curtis Jacobs is injured for some reason, I think that there's some options there. You're not comfortable with all of them, but I think it remains a point. You don't have depth in college football that you're used to 20 years ago of having an All-American behind an All-American, because that doesn't happen anymore thanks to the portal and a bunch of other things. OC Lion, your impressions of James Franklin's comments on Hakeem Beamon still having things to work on. Was he referring to on or off-field issues? Nate, another delicate question I'm going to allow you to answer.
Was he referring to on or off-field issues? Yes. Right? Like, I don't...
Go on.
No, James Franklin has made it clear, and this isn't a mystery. Last year was lost for Hakeem Beamon because of those things, because of that consistency, that lack of consistency, and having all of the things straightened out. Like, it is... College football would be a lot simpler if you didn't have to also be a college student and a student, right? Like, I'm saying college student as in socially. So you all of these things are happening at once, in terms of being 18, 19, 20 years old, and that social tornado, hurricane, right? Of like what that was. I know that Mom, stop watching, not a perfect angel through my college days, but no one cared.
Yeah.
Right. Like that wasn't something that anybody else was paying attention to.
Yeah.
Well, now there are, many more things that that matter, I guess, when it comes to a college football program. And so, yes, for Hakeem Beamon, it is an ongoing process that James Franklin wants to stay on top of to make sure that he can be a productive person, right, in
Yeah.
society,
Yeah.
and then also on the football field.
Can I tell one college story without telling a college story?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I definitely peed a bunch of places I wasn't supposed to, and one of them was a church. So
T-Fanks.
now, in my defense, I didn't know it was a church when it happened. It was just a dark
Mm.
corner, and I was waiting for the bus. So, not the worst thing in the world. Maybe in the world is where we need to stress there. So, yeah, to your point, you're not always on your best behavior. Okay, so PSU Ram. Here's a longer question. Here's a longer question. The sweet spot for the transfer portal for Penn State seems to be guys they recruited and got to know well, but didn't land oftentimes because players never earned their offer. He's thinking of a guy like Ebikidi. Does that change their approach to the overall recruiting so that some of the day down the road at like a lash bash, they'll give more attention than they traditionally might to recruits who show up and they aren't going to get a roster spot, but maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, they'll be ready. I think that this is not. I think it. I appreciate the marks for creativity, but I don't think that it really changes anything because they recruit all the guys the same way. And if that guy later wants to come back because of those relationships, I think they're still there. You don't have to do more than you would otherwise. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think it's also probably selling short the notion that Penn State will also be a landing spot for a guy who maybe chose a quote unquote, like I'm going to say better, but a more prestigious or whatever. I mean, obviously Penn State is going to consider itself a blue blood, but
right.
You know how it goes. If somebody from New Jersey ends up at Texas A&M or Alabama and it doesn't work out, and Penn State wants to be a soft landing for that player, like certainly I think it would be the same dynamic, which is simply Penn State loves to develop relationships. They want to have strong interpersonal relationships. I mean, every graphic that we run at this point, right, in terms of like a comment from a Penn State recruit is how important those relationships are. They feel a connection to the position coach and to the head coach. And so no, I don't think that Penn State will start to divert attention from their top prospects, right? To like on the just in case. I think it is simply a matter of, hey, here are the pool of candidates. Here are the recruits that Penn State is interested in. And these guys know this, right? Like a lot of these borderline recruits who have a bunch of offers and are waiting for that Penn State offer, Penn State's honest with them about that. Right? Like, hey, you got to see how this thing shuffles out and sorts out, and then you can go from there.
That's the part right there. So if you're not honest with somebody, and that is what you would be doing, showing somebody extra attention to you stoke the fire of them being at Penn State and saying, okay, check back in 2 or 3 years. That's going to blow up in your face. Like that, I think is a recipe for disaster, and it's inauthentic, which is what all of these players and their parents feel when they get to Penn State, despite what some people think about James Franklin and the program is he doesn't have to be authentic with you and me. He doesn't have to be authentic with the media. He can be authentic with the players and their families, and that's where it counts.
Yep. No, well, not to mention the fact, and it's funny, I wrote about and listened to Terry Smith with Justin King on his podcast yesterday. And one of the things, Terry was great, but one of the things that he talked about was it is incredibly and increasingly rare to think that your position coach, not the head coach necessarily, the head coach is its own story, but that your position coach will be your position coach for the duration of your college football career. Like, that is how frequently position coaches move at this point. Terry being the rare exception of a guy who has been here for every year of James Franklin's tenure. So yeah, like, if you're a position coach and you're recruiting a kid and say, hey, check back with me in 2 or 3 years, check back with me might be somewhere else, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean Penn State. So I think that's too many dominoes down the line to think that they're game theorying this that far ahead.
Yes. And so PSU Ram has another question here, and I wanted to get this one in because I think this is a great question. And I didn't want to, felt like I was banging on him a little bit for that first one, because I get I get the point of making sure that your relationships are strong in the portal, because you don't know where the next talent is going to come from. But I think just, how we kind of laid it out is they're already doing that. He asks here, though, any update on Sal Wormley? Is he able to fully participate in spring practice? Feels like a huge X factor this year. Am I wrong to think that there's a chance he might not just be a guy in the mix for that guard spot versus someone like Horn Norzad, but may end up being really good? So, because that's what James Franklin said yesterday, right? Was that he was looking great. And I think Juice Scruggs even mentioned that last week of how good he was playing before he was injured last season.
Yeah. It's funny to me, or just curious the way that these things work, where I'm going to digress here for a minute if you give it to me. Last year in the preseason, Franklin brought up Wormley, and I'm going to quote him here, like, as breaking out, or has come on. That was before preseason practice had started, or right at the beginning stages of it. Okay, so, but he was talking about, like, potential candidates there to start. And as we were watching preseason practices, Wormley started appearing more and more and more up with the first team reps. And so when he disappeared, right, like, he no longer part of it, and James Franklin did not announce it at the time in August as a season-ending injury, it was kind of glossed over, and nobody really came back to it. Right? Like nobody asked specifically. And I understand, I mean, certainly from the media's perspective, of which I am a part and you are too, there is a reticence to ask directly about injured players because Franklin has made clear that he doesn't want to talk about it.
We get one question a week sometimes. I'm not going to blow it on is X injured and what's the injury and what's the status. I need other things to talk about here on the show, and it's not going to be one guy being injured. Like, that's a risk I'm not going to take.
But the problem with that, from not really from our side, but for James Franklin, because he brought it up yesterday, is he said that he basically said that we weren't aware of the ascent that Wormley had made, and so it wasn't that big of a deal in terms of how it was covered.
Yeah,
I asked at some point during the season, I want to say October or November, about what Wormley would have meant. And that was the first time that Franklin acknowledged that they lost a starter. Right? Like, the big story of the season is how the offensive line doesn't quite have it together. And one of the key pieces was lost before the year even started. And so I just, it felt to me like this really massive, big story. You like, if Jesse Luketa had been lost for the season before the start of the season, even before he had the success that he had as a defensive end, we all would have been talking about it.
Yeah.
It would have been a huge conversation.
Yep.
But for some reason, Salim Wormley was not.
It's because he's an offensive lineman we've never seen. And that's always the problem specifically with that position, because I don't think most people know what a good or bad offensive lineman is until it's pointed out to them. Because when a run goes well, it's look at the running back. When the quarterback throws the ball 40 yards down the field from a clean pocket, you don't go, wow, look at the protection. That's, you have to be looking for those things. And then when the guy you've never seen before, it's easy to brush that off. And I admit, I did that as well, because I need to know about the players that are playing. I need to evaluate the guys that are on the field, let alone going into hypotheticals that we can't see and we don't talk about because we don't get inside access into practice. So it's partly that, and it's also partly what you described as well.
It's just interesting to me from the perspective of, even if you haven't seen him, of which you're going to have a different perspective anyway.
Yep.
Even if you haven't seen him, you still understand that he was penciled in as the starter.
Yeah.
For the start of the season. So like, if you're the top guy, if you're the top option that they have, then certainly there's going to be a level above, right, whatever that next option is. You know that whoever they have playing at that position is not to the level of the guy who was penciled in to be the starter. So all of that is a long way to say, yeah, no, I think he might not just be a guy, quote unquote, in the mix for a guard spot. Yeah. Right. Like he is a guy who, if he can recover completely and is completely healthy, which is an entirely different conversation. But if those things happen, then absolutely, he's a guy who I think there are high expectations for, or maybe that's the wrong way to put it. There's high hopes for, right? Like, because they need that player to be able to step into that role and be what he was going to be before he got hurt.
So you're going to go and answer this question while I grab one that I don't have here that I want, because there was one that somehow didn't make it on the show. Basketball, need a big man. What's the latest on a transfer? From PSU87, my guy, PSU87 on Twitter. So what's the update here, my man?
Yeah, all quiet on the Western Front at the moment. Certainly the kid from, I never get their names right here, but there's a kid from Lafayette who is, fairly highly attractive, who Penn State has shown interest in and is still on the market as far as I know. And then there's another guy who came in kind of last minute in out of Northwestern, who Penn State has seemed to show an interest in. So yes, basketball needs a big man. What's the latest? Mostly quiet at the moment, but still one of those processes where I think pretty obviously Penn State is active and working to get that solidified. That was a terrible answer, but it is what it is.
Well, I'm still pulling up that quote. So can you give me 10 more seconds on
sure
on where it is?
They also need a guard. That's the thing, is like, I understand people are very interested in the big man element because yes, John Hara is not part of the program anymore. And you can see that, right? Like, they don't have bodies that are 6'7" or bigger. Right. Yep. And you're not going to expect Seth Lundy to be a power forward next year. Right. Or Miles Dredd to be a power forward. So yeah, they've got 2 spots to fill currently. And I'm absolutely certain that is a huge priority for them still in the coming 2-3 weeks.
Yeah.
To land and nail down.
So Losi's mustache, I'll give you a behind-the-scenes thing as you watch me produce live on air, so I apologize for both of those things. But Losi's mustache, one of the epic names in our BWI message board, had a great question. I wanted to get to it, but he asked a second one here that I wanted to bring up because, A, it is a common trope when it comes to James Franklin, the Penn State program, and comparing him to other head coaches. And secondarily, I have some audio for this. So Losi's mustache asks, sorry for a long-winded question, but I want to go back to the conversation last week on James Franklin. Multiple friends think that James Franklin is not the coach to get us to the national championship. We all hear he's a great recruiter. One reason they cite he's not a consistent developer or he's not known for a specific area of talent. Ryan Day, QB developer and offensive mind. Lincoln Riley, QB developer. I'll get into all of those specifically in a second. Dabo Sweeney, program and develops wide receivers. Nick Saban is Nick Saban. So the summation of all these things is the CEO approach having an offensive and defensive success failure rely more so on the coordinators. Do you think that that is something that is good for Penn State, and that James Franklin and his approach is not going to get you anywhere because he's not one of these other guys that has a thing, is what this always comes down to, is he's not known for being a great offensive mind or a defensive mind. He can recruit, but he can't develop. And there's evidence that they've missed in recruiting, but have developed great players. I mean, there's evidence that goes both ways, but we get into these stuck narratives, and here we are. So I wanted to play something from Manny Diaz, former head coach, current defensive coordinator, when he was asked, is there something freeing about just being the defensive coordinator?
I think I'll go a step further, just being a linebacker coach. And getting to have a room again, and getting to have guys that you get to really pour into every day and teach. Because ultimately, as a coach, that's what you are. You're a teacher. So I'm blessed with the guys that I have. I've got great guys in the linebacker room. I'm really fortunate of the defensive personnel in general, not just of their talent, but just who they are. So you get back in the room and you get back to that relationship of being a teacher, and you try to do that as a head coach. There's just a barrier. It's just not the same. So that part's been has been nice.
So there we go. That's to this point. None of those head coaches are doing as much coaching as you think they're doing. They are doing coaching, but if you are focused on, let's take Ryan Day. Let's take Ryan Day in that particular conversation about Ohio State. First off, built-in advantages of taking over Ohio State from Urban Meyer and having that level of talent on the roster. Number one. Number two, their defense was a mess last season. It's an absolute mess. He fired a defensive coordinator in the middle of the season and changed the scheme.
Yep.
Penn State did not do that. Now, in 2020, because they were trying to install a new scheme, we can go through that all again. I don't want to go through all of that again. But Penn State has been consistent. They have had a consistent approach. They have had a logical approach to everything. What they have not had is the same level of talent as Ohio State. Dabo Swinney, he's the same guy as James Franklin, but in the ACC, he's made it to a college football playoff and a national championship. Lincoln Riley, let's take that one. Lincoln Riley develops a great offense in the Big 12 that takes advantage of the Big 12. And is he a great quarterback developer? Or does he make it so easy for the quarterback that they all, you bring in a talented player and they can make it work? Because if he's just this great quarterback developer, what happened to Caleb Williams and Spencer Rattler? Like if lock in it, everyone from Baker Mayfield down to number one overall pick, who's not coming to mind right now? Kyler Murray. All of them developed. They're all great. Jalen Hurts is great in that system. Or is it that the system is great? And you can point to he's a great offensive coordinator, and he's been to a college football playoff, but I just think that there is a grossly averaged narrative about all of these coaches that don't take into the nuanced factors of everything else. Nick Saban is one of the greatest college coaches of all time. He's the Bill Belichick of college. And then all these other guys, especially I'd say Ryan Day, the book is being written. And with James Franklin, there are strengths and weaknesses there, but I don't think he's any better or worse in his CEO approach than these other guys who have a shtick. And not to make it sound less than important, but that's what I'm saying.
I get, and I hear you, and I'm 100% with you. I just get hung up when the question is phrased as James Franklin isn't the guy to get a national championship. And then the first two references and examples are two guys who haven't won national championships.
Exactly. Yeah. They've been to the Final Four, but they haven't won a national championship.
I just keep saying, and like, that's not this strong defense of James Franklin. I am simply saying that college football, as it is presently consisted of like Kirby Smart hadn't won one until just now.
Yep.
So like if it takes having won one to be relevant and
to be a good coach, right?
A good coach, then there are, right? Because like O left, so now Kirby replaces him. So there's 6 or 5 current college football coaches, and Mac Brown being one of them. Like, so his was 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it's just Brian Kelly, like LSU just spent all the money to get Brian Kelly.
Yep.
He don't got one.
Yep.
Right. Like it's just the standard that these guys are being held to. And I understand, like, if you're Penn State, you're eager, you're hungry for a national championship. They need to win the Big Ten again first.
Yep.
They need to get to the playoffs. They like all of these steps. That's just not where the program is. And I think it is incumbent on James Franklin and his staff and the program as a whole, the athletic department, the community, all of it, right, to get Penn State football back to a place where it literally was 5 years ago, but has not been since, and is kind of scratching and clawing. Like that's the broader debate is, can he get, not can James Franklin and his, again, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, shtick, can being a great recruiter be enough to get you, and making great hires, can that be enough to get you back into that Big Ten championship game? That's the bridge that they need to cross, because they haven't been close either of the last 2 years.
Yep. And so I guess my biggest problem is the narrative, is these easy to latch onto thoughts that are base and don't really have the nuance necessary to really explain the situation. And James Franklin may not be, like, if there are plenty of things to criticize when it comes to the game day James Franklin coaching experience. There are plenty of inflexibilities in the way he does things that he's admitted to, that he's tried to adapt over the last couple of years. I think these are all valid things. But when we go into a conversation with somebody and they say, great recruiter, can't coach, like Manny Diaz, the point I wanted to make with Manny Diaz is, you're not coaching. Like, if you're the head coach, first off, there's a balance of this. There's a balance of this conversation. So if I say you're not coaching, I put that picture, I put that last frame of James Franklin in there for a reason. If you're watching on YouTube, he's a part of practice. Every time we go there, Nate, he is an active part of practice on multiple areas: special teams, offense, defense, quarterbacks, running backs. It's not like he's not involved. And I think that people think that he's just sitting in a glass tower watching practice. So
not even there.
That's not true. But then to say that he is not some offensive guru and that's holding them back is also not true. Like, none of these things are true. Somewhere in the middle of, is James Franklin, does he have the foresight because of his football knowledge as the head coach to guide the program through choppy waters to a Big Ten championship berth? He's done it once. Can he continually do that? That is not as easy to boil down to as he's not a special mind on offense and he's not X or Y. It's 1,000 different variables that are all part of a big picture, and that might be challenging to, like, talk about.
Yep.
But it's the truth. And, like, if there's one thing I want this show to be about, and that's why I'm going on about this, is, like, the truth is not so easy to just put into a quote. Like, it's just not.
Yeah, I agree. I don't. The amount of time that we spend talking about the head coach, in really in all of sports, and this is a perspective of mine that has kind of shifted through the years, and this is coming from multiple kind of influences on me in coaching. Right? It's just not about the coaches. Like, it's just not. Like, I mean, I know, I get it. We watch movies and we see what the influence of
a great
Dick Vermeil
speech.
is, right?
Yeah.
Like a great. It's just not that. It's, are your players better than the other team's players? And then do they have a framework within which to work that can be successful? If the answer is yes to those questions, then more often than not, you're going to win games. And, look, like, it's that there are different ways and methodologies to get to where you want to go, but I don't think it's so. I don't think that it's more important to have a certain type of head coach than it is to have all of the other pieces in place.
Right.
Like all of those other, and this, again, like, this isn't to delegitimize what James Franklin is doing, but Penn State's next coach, whoever that is, down the line, will have an infrastructure in place that will be poised for success.
Yeah.
Right. And so as long as the hires are made and the recruiting is done at a level where there can be the personnel that can win games on the field, they will continue to have that success. Like, it's not, it. Yeah, it is what it is. I put far more importance in place on the ability to identify the right personnel, right? Because that's a huge part of this, is identifying the right personnel, talent evaluation, and talent acquisition. If you get those things and then you make the right hires to be and set the right direction, right? Like, if James Frank,
can I just, because you're right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right there is the answer. To set the right direction. Because here's the thing. If you're a great offensive coach, and let's take Chip Kelly for an example. He had a scheme, right? And the scheme was new. Joe Moorhead had a scheme. The scheme was new. It caught everyone off guard. There was an innovation that happened, and they became great coaches because they had this great idea. But you have to be a constantly evolving organism. So if your idea becomes old and stale, and the read option has already been figured out to some degree by defenses, then you're back to square one. You're just another coach that now has to find another way to find that cutting edge. If you're a coach that notices these trends, sees these things, and can go find the next guy for talent evaluation and acquisition at the offensive coordinator position with the quarterback coach, then that's the same thing as having a guy that is continually evolving in a great offensive mind. And James Franklin, I think, a couple detours here and there, has done that. When he saw that his scheme that he brought from Vanderbilt was not working, he went and got Joe Moorhead. When Joe Moorhead left, he brought in Ricky Ronnie. Ricky Ronnie got a head coaching job somewhere else, and we are in an interruption because of what happened with Kirk Shiraka into the first year with Mike Yurcich. So we'll see if he found a guy that can evolve, that was a very effective play caller and a very effective offensive coordinator in a previous stop. The answer of Mike Yurcich is not wrong. It's what you said. Can the players in the scheme develop? So, Losey's mustache, thanks for the question. I appreciate the rant time.
Here's what is fascinating for me to consider is, what if college football stops being about explosive plays and turnovers, right? Like, and there's all the evidence in the world to suggest that those things are what dictate wins and losses by and large at this level right now in the game. What if it changes, right? Like, what if it's, because you know how these things go, right? Like, the game is cyclical, and to steal from True Detective, time is a flat circle, right? So Can James Franklin adjust if that's the case? But there's no reason to wonder that right now, because that's not what the here and now is. James Franklin has identified a methodology that he thinks, given the talent that he is able to acquire at Penn State, can perform, that it is a winning, successful formula. I don't know, like right now, as of today, it's hard to say whether or not that translates on the national level, because Penn State hasn't been on the national level in a few years. But there's an argument to be made based on what we saw last year, and it's a question that will persist going into this year, right? Is the Kirk Ferentz, Jim Harbaugh throwback to the Stone Age methodology of winning football games, is that possible to continue to have success?
No.
Right? Like
no. So again, we got a couple more questions to get to. We're running out of time. But like, one of the things I try to do, and I need to do more of this, truthfully, get more into this if this is going to be my role as the film guy, is like try to understand where the game was going and see the evolution as it's happening instead of talking about it after it's already happened. But if you look at Georgia, I was watching some stuff online and I was doing some research about Kirby Smart and the way he built his defense. And he showed 5 years ago versus his national championship team, and the size of the players was down 15 pounds in some places. They have a linebacker. Curtis Jacobs is 227. Nakobe Dean is 227 or 225. They're the same size. Speed, quickness, explosiveness. You've got to be strong at that size. You cannot sacrifice so much strength. So you got to find special guys still. But even their defensive line, and we talk about Jordan Davis during the draft process all the time, he was a part-time player. Their defensive line was fast, it was agile, and it got after things. And that's the framework of what James Franklin has brought in on defense. That has been his philosophy since Vanderbilt. So these things are correct. Get the players to run the system. What you said, get the players. Because like every time we talk about explosive plays and turnovers, defense, all these things, I agree philosophically with the structure of what they're doing. They have to execute it. And that comes, again, back to the decision-making from the head coach, to the play calling of the defensive coordinator, to the execution of the players. To get their execution of plays.
Also get so many that when you're unlucky and one gets hurt, that it doesn't hurt you.
Yep.
Do that too.
Yep. Let's see where we got a couple more here. We have Ben says it seems Penn State is loaded at tight end. Will we see 3 tight end sets, tight end, fullback, wildcat? Ben, the answer is yes. I don't think that's going away. I think Penn State is going to... They leaned on their tight ends last year. It's just that things were not effective because of the offensive line. The offensive line for a lot of that. When it comes to the wildcat, is what I'm saying. Nate?
Does it seem that way? I don't know. To me, the jury's a little there's something to prove at that position this year. To me, just given what the performance was last year, I think to the questions. Yes, sure. There will be 3 tight end sets and more of Tyler Warren as a wildcat. I don't think that there's any reason to think that that's not the case, unless the personnel that they have in the running back room is better than that and can already fulfill that, right?
Yeah.
Like James Franklin used to say it a decent amount, right? If you've got 2 tight ends on the field, you're taking somebody off the field. Who are you taking off the field? Who isn't going to be in on that play? Is it Keandre Lambert-Smith? Is it Nick Singleton? Right? Like, who's the player that you are sacrificing for to be able to go that way? So yeah, no, I don't. I mean, look, like there's lots of options. It's just a matter of those options proving themselves to be consistent. And if there's one thing that stands out to me about last season at the tight end position, it's that they weren't consistent. Yeah. So we'll see.
The way that Mike Yurcich talked about those players, and I think the physical talent of guys like Theo Johnson, and especially what's making the 3 come to the front, is the fact that Tyler Warren has flashed so incredibly well and has built on that in the offseason as far as his physical talent. So then it becomes, to me, Brenton Strange, can he hold on to a position on the team? He was the best run blocker last year, but is that the case this year with those 2 younger guys developing? So I still think that there's going to be value there, and the way that tight ends at the highest end of their abilities, the way they can destroy a defense, that does change some things for your offense, and you can be more multiple from a traditional heavy set. And that's how you play power football now. That is how you play power football, is you develop a good offensive line that can run block and pass block. And then you have the ability to play pass out of a run set, which, again, isn't anything new. This goes back to the New England Patriots in the 2010s. Okay, so last one here for the show, and I think we've talked about this a good bit on the last rant. John Ashley on Twitter asked, do you see a fundamental shift in defensive personnel brewing, build style of player? Is the general game evolution or more a methodical approach? Yeah, players are getting smaller. You're seeing more DBs on the field, and you've got to be able to find a way to get the numbers in the run game. That's the real rub. But, Nate, to your point, it's not about stopping points. It's about limiting points in college football. So that's why
creating more opportunities.
Yep.
For your offense.
Yep.
By stealing the ball from the opponent.
And this is the reason when you ask, is the old school way of playing football gonna come back around? And my answer is no, because fundamentally the rules and the evolution of the game have given a cheat code to the offense. And if you're playing as if you aren't going to use those rules, and by the way, Iowa does use RPOs and read options. They just don't have, they're running the ball a higher percentage of the time. And they're doing these things with an old school mentality, which is not about maximizing points. It's about limiting the other team from having the ball and playing it safe, playing it conservative. But as long as you're
and cashing in.
Exactly. As long as you're functional on offense against that team, they're going to be tough to beat, but you can beat them because you can get points.
Yep.
They
didn't do anything offense. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
We got to wrap up. I've got an engagement to get to here, unfortunately. So that's going to do it today for the BWI Daily Edition. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr. Thanks to everybody who gave questions to the show. We had such a great conversation that we went about 10 minutes longer than we normally do. We'll be back next week with your questions and more on the Thursday edition, but we wrap up the show tomorrow with a BWI Friday. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr. We'll talk to you then.